interested in this. And actually, I know we have another minute to go to get started, but I think let's
Just
have a
nice.
wide-ranging chat, right? I feel like magic
Yeah,
has these boundaries in many ways, like magic, belief, faith, all of these things to my mind kind of interrelate, right?
yeah, honestly, this conversation can go in the way that you today direct, Sarah. So this is gonna be fun.
It.
Honestly,
Okay.
there is no like set like way, right? I do want to say before we get started, everyone in this call, this video is being recorded. So if you're not comfortable with that yet, we do have a recording like being streamed at the moment that you can jump right into. Another thing is we're gonna have a thread. I would tag everybody in there so that we can know, like, we can drop articles, links, thoughts, or maybe somebody else is talking and you just want to share, or you prefer just to chat in there. This is bustling. I love being in the thread, so we'll chat you guys in there. And that's like the main topic of the day. So we'll go ahead, Sarah. I'll let you go ahead
Okay.
and
Um, all right. Well, first of all, thanks everyone. Basically, I said to Scott in passing, every week I've been coming to this conversation, and it's typically been super interesting thinkers and experts. And I was like, what on earth could I talk about? And I said something to Scott on DM like lol magic. And Scott has never let me forget that. And in fact, absolutely nudged me towards talking about a deep passion of mine that I could not talk about when I worked in Web2. So here we go. Um, oh, can you see that? Can you see the screen okay? Hello? Sorry,
Sorry.
just checking. Because I can't see you in the screen at the same time. Um, yeah, so I'm Sarah. I've spent the last kind of maybe 8 months pootling around various parts of Web3. Whether Gitcoin or crypto culture and society, I've been helping Filecoin Foundation for the decentralized web get set up. And I do a lot of angel investing in kind of community directed products and new power. Whether it's kind of future of work or worker voice, that's just areas that I love. And I've done all kinds of things in the past. I was a really bad journalist. I wrote horoscopes. I worked at Google for a long time. In my last life, I built the responsible tech function at a media network, which is a super unusual kind of impact investor slash social change organization. And I went there in 2018 because I kept looking at like how technology as a community and as a scene felt kind of insufficient to me. We weren't thinking about a little bit into in a minute how we define our terms for this session. But something I've come back to a lot is that you know, magic is a really honest exchange between people. Whether it's a kind of Paul Daniels kind of magic where you're being fooled, you just don't know how, and it gives you an incredible amount of delight, um, or whether it's about sharing collective knowledge with a goal of directing a course of action. So, for the purposes of this conversation, I want to split out two kinds of magic. And this is just the way that my head works. These terms do not exist outside of my head, as far as I know. On the left is what I call kind of performative magic. So Paul Daniels definitely sits in this bucket. This is magic where you might pay an entrance fee, the kind of thing you watch on TV. So, like Houdini is the master of this kind of work, where even now we do not know how he did an awful lot of his tricks, but he's like the master of escapism, mesmerism. I'd put card tricks in this bucket too. So I call all of this kind of stuff performative magic. And on the right hand side, and I've used the tarot card here as an image, but to be honest, it's a bit insufficient, is belief magic. This is magic where at its very kernel, there is a belief in the efficiency of the magic. The only person that you were fooling might be yourself, but there is no proof points for this. And in this conversation, we're not going to go too deep into like the validity of magic. To me, it's more important that the person performing it believes in it. Um, and and so performative magic is really fascinating to me because um, there are all of these contextual implications. So, for example, in North America, when the railroads really began to expand, it kind of 100x the amount of magic that happened across America. You had these like small town traveling magicians come doctors that turned up in your small town peddling cocaine drops. So if we think about all of the implications of railroads, the idea of antitrust against big tech coming from that era, the idea of very powerful families coming from that era, the democratization of magic and scamming also comes from that era. And secondly, another really interesting economic factor is that particularly magic in the late 18th century is one of the only things where women could set up independently and do quite well. So on the left is Helen Duncan, a very famous English spiritualist who was later put to jail. She was the last woman jailed in the UK for witchcraft, partly because, as you can see, clearly she's faking it. On the right, you have a very well known Victorian circus performer. So, in both cases, these are women who, women didn't have careers in this era. They worked in factories, they were governesses, they were servants. There's a lot of theories around why spiritualism rose in the late Victorian times. And a lot of it's to do with gender, the suffragette movement, freedom. But we don't have time for this today. This is a massive, fascinating topic that I love. Seances alone are really interesting. We don't have time for it today. So, what we're going to be talking about is what I've been calling belief magic. And this is the use of means believed to have supernatural power over natural forces. And I pulled a couple of examples of this on the right. So, this can be anything from four-leaf clovers to lucky charms to spells and rituals. It's quite a diverse set of behaviors or rituals, I would say, that speak to different elements of belief. And as I got older, as I began doing an English lit degree, I began specializing, and this is incredibly weird, and this is why I couldn't talk about it in my last life. I began specializing in magic in literature. And I learned that it bubbles up in destabilizing times. So, for example, I grew up in the 1980s in England. Our prime minister at the time was called Margaret Thatcher, the first British PM, a total pantomime villain in many ways. In the 1980s, it was the rise of our financial center. It was the dawn of capitalism as we know it now. It was the fall of the unions. They were absolutely demolished in the 1980s. It was the beginning of the end of the social mobility that really had powered my family. Raves began happening in the very last couple of years of the 1980s. For anyone who was at that amazing conversation 2 weeks ago, so this is an era when like a lot of things changed in a very short period of time. And there's a really strong case to be made that the 1980s was like the crucible of where we are now. And I began looking at previous periods of history and when magic as a theme in society had flared up. And, obviously in the US, the Salem witch trials, very early in the founding of the country, a period of great instability, obviously the kind of genocide being undertaken by a lot of the early American settlers, at the same time as a bunch of Puritans tried to work out how to live together. Top right hand side, the 1960s, very obvious, massive period in terms of magic. Bottom right, I got really obsessed last year with like witch talk, like um, Lana Del Rey, all these really weird rituals around Trump. Like magic will always find new ways of disseminating itself out, depending on the times it's in. And the Renaissance, this is the era that I did a master's in. I actually almost did a PhD in this topic, but I got offered an amazing job at the same time, and I basically took the job. I will do this PhD when I'm older. I think this topic is fascinating. So, if you're looking at the Renaissance, a couple of things happen at the same time. Shout out to Ben, that printing press accounting unlock from his presentation, I want to say like 2 months ago, was a big unlock for me. So, in the Renaissance era, um, the printing press began to enable information to be disseminated at broader scale than it had been before. You had double ledger accounting for the first time, and that took away power from aristocrats and fiefdoms to sort of enable sort of villages to kind of democratize power locally. At the same time, you had the first female monarch of the modern times, Queen Elizabeth, on the left. Very powerful figure, very complicated figure. She was trying to stabilize the country after her dad had basically made a total hash of it, um, had forced the English Reformation through, had created a total new religion in the UK that led to just an awful lot of instability. If we're talking about literature alone, how Renaissance poetry worked is that you would write poetry for the king. You'd write poetry about how he was virile and really strong. Um, and, courtly love was dying out at the time. This is the Chaucerian era that you had to perform romance in a really sort of artificial way to women. But how do you do that when the monarch is a woman? How do you do that when you're talking about her virginity? There is a lot of tensions there between strength, weakness, boldness, risk, Catholicism, Puritanism. And what we see in the Renaissance is this incredible flourishing of magic in literature. Whether it's Dr. Faustus' top right hand corner, whether it's Prospero in The Tempest, there was just this incredible flourishing for like 50 years of magic, whether in terms of plays and poetry or in terms of real life magic figures. So John Dee, bottom right hand corner, um, really interesting guy, a mathematician, an astrologist, who ended up being a trusted advisor to Queen Elizabeth, but also ended up going really into necromancy for the last 5 years of his life. Going a bit too far into like a very particular path that cemented how he's talked about now. And that leads us nicely onto, when we talk about magic, what do we mean by that? And I guess the formula that I've used a lot in my thinking about this is, it's kind of community knowledge. So when we talk about people performing magic, particularly in the Renaissance, it often is folks that like sharing knowledge. These could be herbal tinctures that help get rid of certain infections. These could be, manuscripts passed down for generations talking about, okay, if you want to stop if you want to make a voyage safe, perform this spell. We have no idea if that works or not, but I think it's important in the eye of the beholder that it works. So the first thing is kind of community knowledge. The second thing is kind of solidarity networks. A lot of the folks that perform witchcraft and magic are marginalized folks that are not historically in power. I think it's really important that we say that out loud. And I think thirdly, there's a very strong aspect here of folklore. It made me think of the Venkatesh Rao piece a few weeks back, looking at lawcraft. I buy that idea. So, like, if I think about what I do in my day-to-day life, I'm a community builder, but I really believe in the power of stories, the power of ritual, the power of reiterating meaning and like why we're here, what we're doing here. What have we learned from the past? And I think magic is a mix of all of these three things at different points of time. And magic kind of emerges from below and from the side, not from above. So this is a tattoo that I have, and I presumed that I wouldn't be able to share screen and show you it at the same time. But so something I studied in my master's is this thing called miscellany verse. It's a bit nutty, but basically it was like the moleskin of the 1600s. The idea being that if you couldn't read or write, you would have a chapbook that you carried around made of deerskin, and when somebody came to town performing a play, you'd have these minstrels who traveled from village to village telling stories. This is how you heard about stories. This is how you heard that the king had been deposed. This is how you heard about the story of Hamlet. And somebody locally who was the scribe would copy it down for you. And that's why we have 80 versions of Hamlet, is each time they would change it. They'd misread something, or they'd make Hamlet in the model of the person who was writing up this notebook. And magic passed in the same way. And so when the printing press came in, there was a really strong effort from a couple of powerful magicians of the time, including John Dee, to restrict magic knowledge to those that had the ability to read. And this book, this tattoo that I have, is from an effort. Somebody put together an entire book of magic spells and card tricks using only imagery. So this is a particularly favorite diagram that I have in the same book that basically was an attempt to push past another attempt to restrict knowledge, basically. The idea being that magic and belief is for everybody, which I just love and believe in. And, you know, institutions have always been really scared of magic. They've always been really threatened by it. And when I say institutions, I mean state, uh, classic schooling, obviously the church. This image is basically the start of the trials in Scotland. So when Elizabeth I died, her cousin came in, James I. He was a really interesting guy. He was raised by his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. She was a Catholic. She spent the last 20 years of her life in prison. He was always really caught between a couple of poles of existence. So he was raised by Catholic, so he had to be more Protestant than anybody else in his family. The evidence tells us that he was married to a woman but had male lovers. So there was an awful lot of kind of self-loathing happening there. And throughout his entire career as a king, he was obsessed with witchcraft and persecuting witches. And every time something went wrong in his country, whether it was top left, you can see when his bride came to England, her ship capsized. This happened the entire time. Ships were always capsizing. He basically executed over 100 people for this moment. And so much of this comes from a fear of the unknown, a fear of the new, a fear of what's coming from below. And I think, you know, particularly in this case, a fear of what solidarity looks like in practice. So, you know, to put this in context, and I'm thinking about the UK because, of course, you know, in the US, you have Salem, that was this massive moment. And, you know, I want to make it clear witchcraft trials are happening around the world right now. You know, there are still parts of the world where there are laws in practice that persecute people practicing all kinds of magic. You know, in this time period, if you think that by 1700, the population of the UK was 2 million, you know, we think between 40 and 60,000 people were killed for this, for practicing witchcraft. And, you know, commonly we think of witches as being women, but that's factually not correct. You know, something like 15% of the people persecuted in this time were men. And so I think it was absolutely an attempt to kind of stamp out a certain way of being that was not the conventional way of being. And I guess the way that I've always thought about it is institutions try to exert control. They try to control information. They try to control power. Um, you know, I think magic is an attempt, often by marginalized folks, to kind of subvert that control in a way that I personally am inspired by, excited by, I think is very interesting. And I guess the question that I want to talk through with this group is, you know, I began thinking about when does belief become institutionalized because we've seen this, you know, when, you know, particularly when outlier beliefs become institutionalized, they themselves become a form of power holding. And this is when magic, you know, well, this is when belief moves into the arena of kind of cults, in which case it becomes really not great in some cases. But if magic is community knowledge plus solidarity networks plus folklore, what can and should Web3 learn from it? So that is the question. That was like a bit of a crazy romp through, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can have a conversation, if that's okay. And I also have like a load of references if anybody wants to read more, like Sylvia Federici is an amazing writer on particularly modern witchcraft and economic systems.
I think you should. Okay, first off, incredible. Not trying to cut you off, but I just want a yes and in the form of, I think you should leave up the last definition that we can, you know, extend that and answer it because it's such an interesting, provocative framework for magic that it's community knowledge times. I'm not even getting it right. That's why I want to
Let me
have it.
just let me just bring it back up. Sorry. Yeah, and I just was thinking about like I was trying to because I think it's complicated when you talk about magic. Like I believe in the notion of magic, but obviously within that there are certain forms of magic that I believe in more than others. But that's very personal, right? And I don't want to assume, you know, anything in the field of faith. I feel like you can't. I don't want to be telling people what is and what's not right. That's not my place, right? But the way that I thought about it was like if I had to boil magic down to like a couple of particular facets, I would think about it in this way. So like the last slide, right? This one. Community knowledge, solidarity networks, and folklore.
It's amazing. Okay, so um I don't even know how to like it's such an interesting framework for magic because like I just normally would gut react that magic is what we're not capable of. You know, like we put it into this other category of like, you know, it's magic because I don't understand it. But then having such a clear like this is magic, and I also liked how you were saying like because there's such a weird gatekeeping edge to magic and magicians, maybe specifically just a new age phenomenon where it's like you can't learn the magician's tricks. And you know, there's like this high, like, you know, ivory tower that a magician puts up, like where magic isn't something that should be. Like, is
Yes.
interesting.
And I
I don't know.
struggle, like, this is kind of why I separated out belief and performance magic, because I feel like the minute you start, you know, like, particularly where magic is, like, performative magic is now in 2022, it's very male, very white male. It's very performative, like, it's very late stage capitalism, right?
Well,
Like, it's you can't come in, this is our cool kids club, and I just don't think magic is that. That's not my version of magic, anyhow.
there's a weird, actually, just to like extend that for a quick sec, like performance magic has sort of taken the form of like body horrors. Like, how long can David Blaine stay in a block of ice? Like, how long can he not eat food for? Like, it's just like competitions of like physical food.
Yeah.
It's like not,
And
but
it's weird, isn't it? Because I feel like Houdini did exactly, Houdini was also, like throw me in chains, stitch my mouth up and throw me in the ocean. And like, that's great and very flashy. But if I think about the best magic I've ever seen, it's relied heavily on behavioral psychology and human nuance. And also, I do feel like, when you're seeing blame, what I like about that, you're being fooled. You don't
yeah.
know how. And that's kind of exciting, I guess.
You wanna know who I actually love that I think is he's British, or like he's a Channel 4 magician, is
Yeah.
Darren Brown is
Oh my God. He's
like
complicated, but I love that you love him.
he's kind of
'Cause
like
he's an amazing mesmerist. So like he reads people's mind, like,
it's a weird mix of both being like very intentionally a performance magician, but also like relying on belief magic and like
yeah,
repackaging
that's true.
format in new
It's
ways.
crossover.
Like, there's
Yeah.
it's the yin, it's the yin within the yang or the yang within the yin.
Yeah, and
But
I feel like a lot of I remember when Penn and Teller came out in the 90s, they were really controversial because they were kind of giving away a lot of their tricks. But I feel like, like you always have the option of not watching that. Like I prefer to be, yeah, by performative magicians, I want to be fooled. And I want to be fooled really well. And I want to feel surprised and delighted by what humans can do. But you said something really interesting, Ben, at the start of the conversation around, through the power of belief only, the individual human is really capable of a lot, and a collective of humans is also capable of, like, I really believe that in the power of people as a whole. Want to tell us more about that?
Well, I mean, like a little bit. I'm not sure if this like how much it relates to it, but I was just thinking about how like when you say word magic, most people are gonna be thinking about like performative magics, right? So they'll think like when they connect with it, they understand that there is a trick behind it. So then they know that whatever they're doing, there is a trick behind it without actual magic. So then if there people are actually coming in without the belief that it is real, and only to be convinced because they cannot, to me what I see is that they cannot understand how it happened, and when they can't understand it they rely on what is there, and the explanation from it is magic, which is what they can't explain
Yeah.
in a sense, right? So that's what I was just finding really interesting, and then especially when I saw your definition of magic, community knowledge, solitary network, and like, which is a really interesting perception of magic.
I
When
think
I don't know, yeah, I don't know.
I feel like tarot is the best. Like I feel like you had tarot as one of the examples for belief magic, and it's such a perfect way. I think it's the perfect example for like non-performative magic, wherein like you want like Lynn brings up a really interesting point where magic is used as a shorthand for like I can't explain this.
Yeah.
And then like it's interesting with like tarot that people it's like please explain this to the nth degree. Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
need
Yeah. Yeah.
the wand of pentacles or whatever. Like I'm not so I close enough.
No, but it's super interpretable, right? And I think we all want to understand more things than we can, and we all want to be able to see the future, even if the future scares us. This is like the rise of horoscopes, the rise of tarot. I think it's all about humans' attempt to find structure in a world that often is really structureless, right? Like, we look at what's happening and we're like, I'm so confused by this. Um, it's that point around every sort of resurgence of interest in magic corresponds to a time period where there is, an awful lot of kind of world history happening at the same time. Sorry, Cosmo, I think you were gonna. I haven't modded Discord before, so bear with me if I'm missing people. Sorry. Cosmo, were you speaking then?
Hey.
I think that they're just like off mute, but
Yeah, I think I'm
happy to
asking to
create
be off
space for
mute.
Cosmo.
Sorry about that.
Or maybe this is like magic and we need to divinate their intention.
Let's divinate, yeah.
I think what's also I don't know if you guys already mentioned, I was away for a little bit, but also when people do like predictions, like when you go in and you guess like what is your future, that sort of thing. So like I think my parents went like I can't remember, I don't know what it's called in English. Sometimes like I just know in Vietnamese, but like you go into a person, they predict like your future, right? So my parent went to that, and apparently I said I had a great life where I'm gonna be super lazy. So that's awesome. Um,
Mazel
but I
tov.
think, but also I think what I really like about it is the self manifesting of those predictions, which is what Ben mentioned earlier about like if you believe it will happen. And so I think that's true, like especially when you have a limiting belief. then you act in a way that is self-limiting, that therefore it predicts your future. But if you know that you can be greater, or like for example, stories where you know that you're gonna be a hero, you're like the chosen one, then you just happen to move accordingly to what you believe is,
Yeah.
like out away from the norms and away from like that you think you can make it, so you dare to take risks, and those risks have high risk or like you don't hear right, and then you don't hear the stories of those who failed because
Yes.
it was like was it called survivor biases? Okay, I
Well,
can't
and
remember.
if you look at like nearly every, whether it's Houdini or the most well-known executed witches in the 60s, like if you look at like magic through time, in nearly every case, they're people that have resisted the obvious path. These are outliers, these are radicals with absolute self-belief. In many cases, I could argue that all the persecuted witches that were taken to court were people that knew too much and weren't afraid to shut up and be deferential. So I think there's a lot there to unpack around self-belief and how that ties into, our beliefs and things that are not, that we can't see in front of us.
Yeah, I think in addition to like I guess what I was saying more at the beginning is belief is a catalyst more than belief is like a north star or like a force of gravity towards a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like what I was saying in the beginning is that belief can unlock things within you that are real. And so like the example I gave was like the placebo effect. Like if you get your leg cut off, you create painkillers within yourself so that you don't feel the pain of your leg being cut off. But that just
That's
means
right.
that your body can create those painkillers naturally. And if you believe that your leg has been cut off when it hasn't, you can still like force manufacture manifest that situation into yourself. And so like all I'm trying to say is that like beliefs can create more than we anticipate within ourselves and that we think are capable of ourselves. And then that gets really crazy when you get into collective belief, where it's something that we all share, but we have like different visions and versions of. But like through that shared narrative or lore or whatever, like arises these crazy, or not crazy, but like magical phenomenon that like we wouldn't expect. And so it's just I don't know, beliefs are really powerful. They're super,
Yeah.
super. And so I think that it's usually like a lack of imagination when people like close off beliefs and they're like, I don't believe in your belief. It's like, okay, like that's not how it works, but okay, sure.
I think that, and I think that's a cool point, right? Like there are many different kinds of belief systems out there of all sorts, and I think it's, like to the point around magic, I'm thinking of like friends with very particular backgrounds have like very particular beliefs, and in some cases they overlap, some they don't. Um, but I keep seeing folks unmute and then mute again, and I want to give space because I feel like I'm not modding as effectively as I could.
I wonder how we tie this to like what Web3 can take away. Essentially, what is like the topic of the discussion, right? So
Yes.
I think what I like about this the most is the vision that it sets, because belief is essentially it's like a way to have a vision and moving toward that in a way, right?
Mm.
And I think and it ties back to like collective belief. So like a lot of it is, was it like word of mouth? Is it because they can't explain it so they believe it themselves? Like I wonder what is like the most like um impactful in terms of like changing one's belief. Like
Well,
what
and
is
I want to, I love that question, Lynn, but I want to widen that out for this group. So all of us will have had a moment where we're like, oh, Web3 is really interesting. And then we might have had a further moment when we're like, oh my God, this is the future. And I want to ask people like, what was the moment that kind of unlocked your mind? Was it a person? Was it an article you read? Was it a group you're in? Like what was the green pill moment for many of us?
Um, I wanted to touch on both of those things. Wait, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, one was like, how do you reach that like change of belief? I think like it's also like tapping into that. Oh, there's a higher potential like I could achieve or a society we could achieve, and I think that also ties into Web3. Like it's like that idea that we're no longer tied or like slaves or like whatever to these like monetary systems or these like monoculture of financial systems where there's like only one way to transact money. There's these jobs we're tied to that are draining. There's like extractive mechanisms instead of, so now we actually like with these digital currencies and ability to coordinate new ways to coordinate and new ways to tie our ecological health with our economic growth, we can actually like we are conscious that we're like designing the like literally designing our future, designing like what we care about, what we value, how we transact that value, and how we share that with others. So it's like for me it was like that realization that okay, I've always been a believer, and I know that like my mentality, my fitness, how I eat, what I eat, like impacts my internal biology and even my genes and everything. And as soon as I jumped into Web3, I'm like, oh, that's also the case for like our currencies, our work, and everything in between, and how society lives. So that was the big unlock for me. And a specific point as well was the ability to actually bring these currencies or these local economics, local impact economies to areas where are already unbanked. So how can we start from scratch and enable them to start transacting value and tying that and enabling them ways to finance their activities that are like ecologically rewarding or rewarding those givers, those that meditate you and like those ask anything back from anyone that were in their host their sessions and stuff like that.
I love that. And actually, like meditation in itself is both a practice and a form of belief, right? Like I think this is what I mean by like the borderlessness of magic when you begin thinking about it. Like some the things that I cluster under magic can kind of really infiltrate many areas, and I kind of love
Mm.
that.
I
Anybody
think
else want to share their Web3 conversion tipping point? Right? Oh, David?
Can I share? Um, for me, it was reading the Bitcoin white paper because that just showed me there's
Oh,
actually
I think I'm
something that's
missing sound. Is
impervious
somebody
to government
speaking?
meddling. Can you
Oh.
hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
David, were you gonna go?
I can hear him, but I don't think you can.
Oh,
This happened last week. I don't know what's happening where it's like
right.
speakers get boxed out or something.
Maybe I'll go out and come back in.
I can hear you, David. You the Bitcoin white paper is what got you.
Reading the Bitcoin white paper. Thanks for sharing that, Ben.
Sorry, no, it's
I'll give up.
No,
When
that's-
I read the white paper, I was convinced and sold. When I met the Dow folks, I was sold even further. The end.
Was anybody a crazy skeptic and then converted? Because I definitely had my skeptic phase. It was kind of long.
I definitely was a skeptic. Because I would just say that the only reason why I was a skeptic was because I didn't understand what it was. And you know, when mainstream kind of shows you all the like they talk about the big thing, which is like money when talking about crypto, and in a sense, essentially it is like in definition is money, is it not, right? And so therefore I was like kind of shying away. I kind of put in the chat as well, but like because I'm a girl in like the tech field, and then also when you dive even deeper into the crypto side, is very strong male dominance, right? So that's what I saw, and I just didn't want to get into it. But I just happened to got looped into Gitcoin and starting on this work, and what blew my mind was that I think being connected to the builders, the people who are creating the space, as opposed to people who are like on the side of like not getting involved into like creating the space, right? Um, that just made sense to me because like we're having this conversation in the library. We're talking about bigger meanings. We're talking about why we're doing this. Most of the time, you don't hear about the why. You don't hear about the whys behind banking. You don't. You just use it. You don't hear the whys behind like why does this Bluetooth work? We just use it, right? So I think most users are like in that stage of like I use it because it makes sense and I need it, but they don't for like dive into further. However, I am lucky that also I think everybody in this room is very lucky that we are all somewhat tied into this builder network because we're here in Bitcoin. You somehow have to know about this space. And then we talk about these conversations and the book Green Pill when they set out a vision, they say this is what can happen. This, if this happened, then if A happened, then B can happen, then C, which is our vision, can happen. but that requires collective belief. So then it makes sense, like when there's an actual path that I can see, like, okay, you're saying this can happen because like if they have like a plan, like they know if this were to happen for sure, the B would happen. Then I was like, okay, so if I'm on stage A and we all make it happen, we make A happens, then B will happen, then C, which is the final stage, will happen. So it's kind of like a domino effect to my eyes. And if we're at the beginning of things, right, we're like the early adopters, early innovators, right? And so there's this chance that it will happen. And what is interesting to me is the adoption of phones. It's so fast. Like, what is it, 1995-ish time to like 2022? Like so many people around you, like especially in like more like first world, like country, right? First countries. We have access to phones already, and in so many spaces so now information is being connected. So it doesn't seem far away that the future that we imagine can happen. It's just about the adoption rate and what we can do about it, which is which is doable in the sense that internet connects you even faster to these ideas than books alone and news media alone. Because now, but there's always a downside to everything, right? Because too much of this.
Well, and that's why you need folklore and solidarity networks and community knowledge, right? Like,
So that's my more take on it. But I talked a little bit too much. But
no,
I
I
hope
think
everybody else
you
also
make a
share.
really good point, right? Like, if we think about cycles of technology, and like, I spent a year living in South India in 1998, and I didn't take a phone because I didn't have a phone then. And like, that isn't that long ago, right? My dad was a self-taught developer, so like, I had tech people in my life, and still having a phone wasn't universally a thing then. And I'm old, but I'm not that old. Like, I guess my questions for the group are, like, how do we build more kind of solidarity networks? I know Gitcoin is kind of that, but also how do we think about folklore and community knowledge? Because those are things that, you know, both build up from below and over time. But, you know, they need to be stewarded with care. And, you know, if you look at the example of miscellany verse, like, none of those, very few of them survived because of the materials they were made in. But, you know, when you were transposing Hamlet between the copy of Hamlet that the actor who came to your town had and into your chapbook, you know, got mistransposed, words got missed, not loads, but enough for it to feel manifestly different. And I think that's kind of a beautiful thing, you know, the idea of copy left. But I'm curious what it means in the context of Web3. Like, you know, we're kind of trying to shape, you know, as Gitcoin, we're trying to shape the best possible version of Web3, right?
So I just want to add my personal 2 cents about the question you asked, which is like, when did you see the magic of Web3? Like, and honestly, it really is crazy to see it like as community knowledge, solidarity networks, and folklore, because my like green pill moment exactly touches on these three things. And so the thing, like I came into the space 2017, 2018, and one of the biggest things that happened then was the DAO hack. And this absolutely radicalized me because the malleability of belief, communal belief, like, it's not the technology, but it is the community knowledge of these protocols that binds the participation towards these protocols. And so it's more of like the solidarity networks that these protocols and communities have built rather than technology itself, which is a function of folklore, which is like, you've just super
open source. I could make a really strong argument for open source resting on folklore and community knowledge and solidarity networks, right? Open source is literally that, right?
The only moat that you have when the marginal cost of copy pasting and changing a new thing is like the belief system that you have people like not only opting into, but creating, co-creating, and like reiterating over and over and over again. And so like without that folklore or community solidarity network, like without that overlay, you just have infinite, like it's the binding agent, it's the moat, it is what keeps people here. And it's so interesting to me that it's like super supercharged, super powerful, because it's like one of the most, like, it is human to mirror. Like, we are social animals. Like a baby, you stick your tongue out at it, like it's 30 minutes old, it'll stick its tongue back out at you. Like, we are just social mirroring animals. And so like the fact that we now have financial instruments that can mirror not only our own personal beliefs but communal beliefs is like, that's wild. That's cool. I'm into that. Excited to see what happens. but yeah, I just think that like this is such a good framework for understanding Web3 because it's like we should understand that this is a backdrop of like open source and like the things that bind communities to these protocols or projects in open source is the folklore and the solidarity networks, the community layer is the bottleneck through which open source
But I was
travels.
thinking about this in the context of like institutions trying to stamp down, right? Like the church, the state, big tech. I think these days we know they're institutions, right? And I think Web3 is still building up the institutions. I have a real belief in the need for there to be bottom up institutions built. But I saw a tweet this morning that really struck me around open source that was saying, it was like a flash page for some open source event. And like the users of open source are like the world's largest and most powerful tech companies. And all the conference sponsors are like random startups. And it was reminding me of like how so often community networks become captured or extracted, or the people involved feel cheated or tricked in some way. Which takes me back to that the honorable exchange of magic, right, versus the dishonorable exchange of extraction.
Ooh.
Anybody else want to pick up on Ben's piece around how Web3 can kind of learn from this formula of what magic is? Or even talking more about your Web3 kind of green pill moment, just because I always love hearing what opened folks' minds or what got them really excited about the scene.
And just to follow up on Ben, the thing that I'm thinking about is kind of the like club mentality, like the sort of insular nature of magic and sort of like the secret handshakes and the needing to know the right people. Like it's part of what makes the DAO space kind of impenetrable and also feel like a very close knit community filled with like sort of secrets that we're all in on, and we're trying to sort of bring people to be part of. I think it's almost kind of captured in a sense by the idea of being green pilled. Like it's this like magical transformation that's happening when you sort of become part of the space.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like for me, my kind of getting involved in crypto had a lot to do with who introduced me to it. I probably would have had a very different reaction to crypto if, it was like some right-wing libertarian, pro-oil person that I was fighting against that was talking about it. But instead it was like, lefty, also sort of libertarian, but, much more on the sort of social libertarian end of the spectrum. Yeah. Just like an anti-establishment, progressive, really interesting person. I mean, small aside, but it was actually kind of a magical thing for me because he was showing me a dehydrator he'd built on the back of a Bitcoin mining rig in the back of a yoga studio, which he was showing me largely because I was an environmentalist and I was looking to rent his yoga studio for a pipeline protest event. And he just thought I might be interested in this dehydrator he'd built in like Creative Commons licensed. But I mean, that was my first introduction to Bitcoin, and then it opened up all kinds of, understanding around sort of how this could be a tool for, changing the status quo, and and I associated it with kind of anti-establishment values as opposed to something very different. So I guess where I'm going with this is like, if we want more people to become part of the space, perhaps we need to take a close look at our own secret handshakes and sort of how we make the space inaccessible, but also try to not lose the, metaphorical magic, I suppose, of like being part of something special together.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think there is this tension, obviously, between inclusion and exclusion. Like, when I worked in magazines, putting the word secret on the title, you always saw 20% jump every single time. It was like the only rule, the only thing I learned working in magazines was that people love secrets. They want to feel like part of some kind of in club, but that is complicated, right? Like to your point around the magic circle and how like most magicians, most amateur magicians hate the gatekeepers at the magic circle because they're like the cool kids club where it's like, okay, you don't know enough secrets, you can't come in. And I think there's if we're thinking about like the roles that various folks play in various styles or various scenes, I feel like there's a role for so many translators to work in the scene that help to spread the folklore. that are performing the work of the traveling actors in the Renaissance, going out with the versions of Hamlet. And I think all of us do this in our day jobs anyhow. Like, this is something I think all of us are doing a lot right now anyhow, of kind of bringing folks in. But to your point, it matters who brings you in. It matters what words they use, and it matters where you land. And I don't think that's a technology solution so much as it is a human solution, and a solution around solidarity networks, right? And this group kind of working out, like, okay, how do we talk about this work? How do we think about this work?
Yes.
Because a lot of part about magic is like folklore, right? The ability to share that story. And folklore are pretty easy to understand. Where when it comes to something more like crypto, you have the white papers, which is a lot more harder to access. Either it be a language barrier, it be a high understanding kind of barrier, having you have to understand the context before you understand these things, right? So I think a lot of it is also access to information. Like, can you actually understand this? Can you break it down to simpler terms? And can the story be spread? Can children understand it? Because folklore also passed down to children, right?
Yes.
And so isn't that like part really important? And so I think narrative. I think we talk about this a lot, but I think narrative is really important in storytelling when it comes to
Yeah, and
like.
I think I agree. And I think folklore as a term, it can mean many things, right? Like, folklore is just something that is repeated enough that it becomes common wisdom in a particular group. So that could take the form of a story that your grandmother tells you at bedtime. It could take the form of a white paper. But I think what you're getting at is really important is, I'm a big believer in historicism, the idea that every artifact has context around it, and that without the context, you lose some of the meaning. And so, when I first read the Bitcoin white paper years ago, I was like, I don't understand this. All the folks that I know in this space are like right-wing, money-obsessed idiots. This is not for me. Like, it actually totally turned me off the scene for years. And I think there's, for all of the talk about community in Web3, I see a real lack of care given to kind of content and narrative and words. And I think we have to get a little bit better about talking about what we do and why. I think Gitcoin are pretty good at this, but there's lots of other DAOs, and I'm particularly thinking of famous Twitter personalities that I find a bit challenging in the space. And they know exactly what they're doing, but it's not for me, I guess. Their kind of folklore doesn't resonate with my ears.
Exactly, and I just wanted to build up on that because I'm coming from DreamDAO, and I think I'm still pretty new to this whole universe. But I
Welcome.
think yeah. But I think what made it really easy to kind of get access to it was just the spirit of we're all learning together. So it's very low threshold to get into it, and yeah, it's also that has to do with community and with narratives, and yeah, with just building these bonds with each other, and yeah, just evolving around the along the way, so you don't have like this mindset, well, there's just a bunch of books that I have to read and all the research has been done already, but you're getting into it and you become an active part of it.
And
Sorry,
I'll just
just
build upon what Angelina just mentioned. So like I'm also a part of the Dream DAO, and like I and Angelina, like both of us like builders and stuff. And yesterday I was having a conversation with like one of the members of a DAO called Solarpunk DAO, and we were like discussing like what about the people, like what about connecting the people who are neck deep into Web3 with people who are like not even toe deep into it. And like one perspective that I got like during that like discussion was like, if we are just mindful of our like experience as like who we were before and what made us transition and who we are like today, and for the people who are like not even toe deep, just understand what's going on and just understand the vision, and then connect these two aspects together in the form of blog posts, in the form of like these community town halls, in the form of these narratives. I think like that is the best way of like bridging social capital. And yeah, like that's one of my like main aims. Like that's something I'm like really looking forward to like happening in multiple DAOs and everywhere.
yeah, I really like that. Because what I'm hearing is you're basically leading with empathy, right? You're saying, okay, I know stuff now, but I didn't know stuff 6 months ago, and therefore there is no cool kids club. We are all learning together.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think we have 5 minutes left. If anyone who hasn't spoken so far wants to jump in,
I can jump in
that would be
if
great.
that's okay.
Yeah.
Well, what you were just talking about just made me think again about the quote that was in the chat, that sufficiently advanced technology being equivalent to magic, and it just kind of made me think, that performative magic is kind of the art of taking a sequence of deterministic kind of sleight of hand acts and abstracting it away behind patter and intrigue and showmanship, which is kind of just a straightforward analogy for building out a really good UI to Web3. And the most enjoyable magic is the magic that leads a person, using pattern showmanship to lead a person so that their belief in the trick is just inevitable by the end. And you can do that with Web3 folklore, be it solar punk, green pill, whatever, and a kind of preservationist attitude to the Web3 history and UX and UI that's just designed with the users in mind. The parallel is just so strong.
I'm watching bed. Yeah, I was thinking about this. I saw this this app called Linear that's just launched, and it's basically it's a tool for engineers. I'm not an engineer, but the story of, I'm just going to find it for you because I was so delighted by how they talked about who they are and what they're doing. And it was just amazing folklore, to be honest. And they actually use the term magic in there. I'm just going to put it in the chat. They actually put it as like the title. And it basically reads like, it has elements of manifesto, but it just reads like a beautiful story around the fire that makes you want to be in their gang in like the best possible way. And to your point, like, yeah, great products should feel like magic, great experiences should feel like magic. Not necessarily because you don't know how they're happening, but because of that spark it creates in your brain. That sort of like resonance almost.
Yeah, it's so awesome. The other thing that came to mind was just the way that magic is kind of a two-way street between the performer and the audience. It's not just a kind of one-way thing. Often sort of a meditative thing. Once someone starts doing something like performing that way, your mind can't go anywhere else. It's like a meditative thing to perform some magic for someone, and the performer and sort of reciprocates with some escapism and entertainment, and just sort of the overall idea of performative magic is to increase happiness overall, through
so
an
right.
anti-authoritarian kind of utilitarian idea. There's parallels in Web3.
I was just going to say, like, you're totally right, because ultimately, performative magic exists in the space between the performer and the recipient of that performance, right? So it's very much like a social contract that exists for that moment in time. And I think, belief magic is far more about collective, like if we're thinking about like covens or group belief. But, I think to that point, it relies upon deep listening and deep care. Like if you're an amazing performance magician, what you're doing is judging the other, you read the other person and that tells you how to fool them. Okay, so I think we're out of time for today. I really enjoyed this conversation. I might try and write up this deck into like a little post just because I enjoyed working on it so much. And everything that people have said has really sparked a ton of ideas. So I want to thank you for joining me. I want to thank Scott for nudging me to pursue this wacky hobby into a presentation. And I hope you have an amazing Wednesday.